we're going to get started with the fourth and final panel.
So I bite to work?
Yeah. So our panel, the status quo proponents, Antitrust Doctrine is just fine, thank you. I'm Karina Lubell, and I'm from the Capitol Forum, and we have a lot to get to, and we're short on time. We have a lot of panelists, and so I'll just briefly introduce everyone. I think you should all have their full bios with your materials. But to start furthest from me, we have Gabrielle Kohlmeyer, who's Associate General Counsel at Verizon. She covers antitrust and strategy issues. Next to her is Randy Long, who is Director of Competition and Consumer Protection, Consumer Protection Policy at Microsoft. Next, we have Amanda Waite, who is a partner and head of the Competition and Consumer Protection Practice at Hunton Andrews Kurth. Next to her, we have Amy Ray, who is a partner in the antitrust group at Oric. And to my left, we have Marianela Lopez-Galdos, who is Director of Competition and Regulatory Policy at the Computer and Communications Industry Association. So thank you to all of our panelists for being here. To kick things off, I'd actually like to bring up the title of the panel. The Status Quo Proponents, Antitrust Doctrine is just fine, thank you. Since I think that there may actually be some debate among you on what we mean by the status quo and where we are with respect to antitrust doctrine. So why don't we just start with a threshold question? Is there a problem? And in other words, do you think that we're in a good place with respect to the economy or our protections as consumers and citizens more generally? And if not, do you think the deficiencies in antitrust enforcement and policy is to blame, at least in part? Now, FTC Bureau Director Bruce Hoffman asked these questions during his keynote, and he, I think, expressed a little skepticism, at least about the latter, based on discussions during the FTC hearings, but I'd be really curious to hear from our panelists on that. And so I think, Amanda, if we could start with you.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So kind of starting with the first question, are things good now? I think it depends a little bit on the lens that you're looking through. So I have two small children, 3 and 5 years old, and every day I come home from work and my 5-year-old says, "Mom, how are you?" "I'm great." So from a 5-year-old's lens, everything is great. Listening to the last panel, I actually came away from it a little depressed. There was a little bit of gloom and doom, and I'm going to walk out to Main Street in my neighborhood and, I'm going to get whacked in the head by Amazon or something. I think, thinking of it through a slightly different lens, there's a lot of different statistics that you can look at. Unemployment is at a 50-year low. GDP is increasing quarter over quarter. Corporate profits are increasing. Now, some may say that's not a great thing, but from a deal lawyer's perspective, that means that there's a lot of transactions happening. I'm seeing that in private practice, and that gives the agencies opportunities to take a look at those deals and figure out what to do with them. So from the perspective, are things good right now? I think from my perspective, I would say yes, and they certainly could be worse. I know others on the panel will take a different view, but why don't we start with that?
Yeah, thank you. Gabrielle, do you agree with that assessment?
So I think that it is right. It's kind of the lens. Well, first, I do want to say if there's a problem, the problem is with the title of the panel, because I think that, what is the status quo? I think the status quo is fine, thank you. It's not where I would come out in terms of antitrust doctrine. But I think that we need to look at things kind of holistically. And I think that there are a lot of issues that do give rise to concerns and very legitimate concerns. And the questions are more down the line of, is it an antitrust concern? Is antitrust doctrine sufficient to address those concerns? And I think that's where I have less concerns about where we are in terms of the antitrust laws on the books, because I think that they're really dynamic. I think that they are very flexible and they have evolved over the last 100 years. I think that to stop them in time at any point, whether we're talking about in the 50s or in the 70s or in the 90s, and have them ossify to that. I think that would be a problem. And so to me, one of the things that is really good about what's going on right now is that there is this debate going on that I think is really healthy and really good for antitrust, for assessing, where are there trouble spots, where are there things that we need to address, where are there places where we can sharpen our tools, and where do things need to be refined, and where can we, continue evolving the tools that we have to be most effective. So I think that I'm not quite in the space where I think everything is fine, but I think that we have a lot of tools, and it's kind of more of a question of how can we implement those most effectively.
Thank you. And I guess I'd be curious to hear from the rest of you. Gabrielle has pointed out how the current tools are flexible enough to address some of the current issues when it comes to tech and to big data and things like that. I'm curious, do you all agree, and can you maybe provide some examples of that? And I guess I asked that question from thinking about things that, why it seems to me that to some extent they might not have been working, these tools might not have been working so far. And so what is it that we would need to be doing to make sure that they are able to address the problems that you see today, to the extent you see them? Maybe Randy, do you want to start next?
Sure. If I could, for a second, before we get to that, go back to the prior comments and on the panel's title and so forth. And I think that when we talk about whether there's a problem, we need to be kind of precise about defining what the problem is. We heard on the prior panel that and we've heard in, from the FTC hearings and in a range of debates so far, a number of concerns that are sort of sound in the political, social, not necessarily in the economic sphere. And I think we need to think about what is the problem that we want antitrust to solve. If it's social, if it's political, antitrust is an incredibly blunt tool to solve those problems. We heard some commentary about in the prior panel about issues in the middle of the country where there's perhaps some concerns about income inequality. These are real and very serious issues. And one of my concerns would be that if you use antitrust to attack it, you're not going to get the response that's needed, where you might need something that's a little bit more of a sharper tool to address some real concerns that are out there. If you want to solve a competition problem, then antitrust is the tool you pull out of your toolkit. It's a tool that's designed to produce robust competition amongst the most effective competitors possible, most efficient competitors possible. So getting to your point about remedies and how would we approach it, there's been some talk about what is the, should we use rulemaking, should we use burden shifting? Those are things that we can absolutely have a conversation about. If we're talking about burden shifting, I'm not sure so much that that's going to make as much of a difference as people hope that it would. But perhaps a better solution would be to look at things. I believe Sandeep on the prior panel mentioned that a lot of the authority that the agencies need is actually already vested in them. And I think to a degree that's probably right. And I think that, I'll share some views on that, but I want to let the other panelists talk as well.
Thank you. Nella, do you want to maybe go next and both, feel free to talk about both the title and then also.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure to share this afternoon with you all. So this is a wonderful day where CCIA, for the sake of transparency, we represent Facebook, Amazon, Google, and many other smaller companies. We are going to agree with Verizon and Gabrielle in the fact that, whereas there might be a very good legitimate concern about market concentration, rising inequality, our position is that the current antitrust framework it's good enough to tackle potential problems that may arise. The consumer welfare standard, it just shows the evolution and the dynamism of antitrust laws and how we've managed to come to terms with having a standard that can be administered before the courts, but also protects competition policy from political interference with the aim of protecting consumers. And I think that is very important. That doesn't mean that we cannot look into new things or new problems, and that we need to look into new challenges that the digital economy brings about. I think what the FTC is doing with the hearings is a really important thing. I look forward to seeing the reports. I think we should all learn. I didn't know anything about the digital economy 20 years ago. Probably so didn't you. So I think it's very important that instead of just jumping into regulation, into investigating, because it's Google, Facebook, big companies, bad companies, let's just make the case and do kind of reverse engineering and make sure we sanction them, so we prove to everyone basically that we're doing something. Let's really identify where consumers are being harmed and see how we need to tackle. Some questions are really challenging, and I think there's a lot of research to be done, and I think we're in the process of doing that. And I hear often here in the US that what the European Commission is doing is what we should do. We should copy what they're doing. They're doing everything and we're not doing anything. Well, I come from Europe. I actually come from a country that has 30% unemployment rates, Spain. And so if you ask me whether the US economy is doing good or bad, well, it all depends on the lens. I think it's doing quite good, but I also think it's very legitimate, all the problems that are being raised. I don't want to minimize those. When you look at how competition law is enforced in the EU, I think it's a similar system, but with a lot of differences. I think before jumping into praising what the EU is doing, which they might be doing good things and maybe not so good things, I'm not going to position myself there. I think it's very important to understand what the institutional design is in the EU and how it shapes substance, and whether there is political forces that also shape how the competition cases come out in the EU. I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying that is worth studying that, and I'll stop there for the moment.
Okay, thank you. And so, Amy, I'd love to hear from you, and happy for you to address some of the questions that we've already discussed. The other thing I'd like to throw in there is, Randy had mentioned that antitrust is really a blunt tool to solve some of the social and political concerns. I think from earlier in the day, Teddy, when he opened up the conference, he'd mentioned, cited Tim Wu as talking about the goal of antitrust is about more than just cheap stuff, and I think we've heard that again and again. Daniel Kishi mentioned this on the last panel about the sort of the failings of thinking about Americans as only consumers, and I guess so. My additional question for you is. It seems that there is a real concern that if we have a laser focus on prices, then we're kind of missing the boat. And is antitrust able to are we able to use antitrust tools as they currently stand to address issues related to non-price issues like innovation or variety and other non-price considerations?
Just to take that last question, I think the agencies have been rather successful in doing that. Especially the Department of Justice has probably brought pure innovation theory cases, and that's happened in Europe and elsewhere. But it would be unfair to criticize the consumer welfare standard as being myopically focused on prices. I would just say, and this is to paraphrase something that my grandmother used to say, if you're raised on the consumer welfare standard, you like the consumer welfare standard. Those of us that are in this room, it's been our gospel for 40 years. So it's a little difficult for those of us who are practitioners to step out of our shoes and critique it. And when I say we, I say the U.S. Antitrust Bar, and we're not accustomed to sampling alternatives to it. And there are some out there. Certainly, I think there are more countries that follow the European Commission's evaluation of what goes into competition enforcement than the United States, but we can talk a little bit later, perhaps, about whether we've been successful in exporting our brand of competition elsewhere. Here in the U.S., what we face and what enforcers face, and those of us who encourage enforcers to take action sometimes, is ultimately you have to be successful in court. And that's, I think, where some of the challenge comes in. There's this combination of enforcement discretion with the reality that we don't hear about the investigations that agencies decide not to pursue, and that leads to a perception of under-enforcement. And then the flip side of the coin is there's this reality that U.S. antitrust has a healthy fear of over-enforcement and how it could undermine the benefits of free competition. So I think the extent and depth of your battle scars in those types of matters might determine where you come out on the perceived under-enforcement, over-enforcement divide. I'll also say, picking up on one of the comments, is we just aren't privy to public details about big data and tech investigations that could be happening on our shores right now. So we shouldn't be too quick to judge and say that those aren't in the early stages or going to happen. We have seen enforcement picking up in the EU and Germany and elsewhere, and that just might be the genesis of the feeling that our tools perhaps haven't been working.
Thank you. I want to actually go back to something that you brought up about the importance of winning cases. Because I think even Commissioner Chopra earlier during his fireside chat said that no agency wants to bring a lot of cases that they're going to lose. Yeah. And I think one of the concerns that you're hearing from a lot of the proponents for some sort of legislative correction to the antitrust laws is that, look, we've got 40 years of bad case law, and just because the agencies decide to get a little more aggressive or to think about things slightly differently doesn't mean it is not going to enable you to overcome the jurisprudence. And so I guess I'd be interested in hearing from each of you in whether you think that that is a valid concern and how it could be adequately addressed without some sort of legislative solution. So maybe, I guess, Amanda, do you want to jump in on this one?
Sure, happy to. I mean, I've got to take a little bit of issue with the concept that we've got 40 years of bad case law and that it's resulted in all bad decisions. In surveying some of the literature in preparation for this panel, I was reviewing, some of the critiques of the consumer welfare standard, and they really kind of boil down to a couple things. And I'm sure I'm missing them, so I don't mean for this to be all inclusive. But some of the primary concerns that I hear is that under enforcement or utilizing the consumer welfare standard over the past 40 years has resulted in a huge increase in market concentration as measured by very broad industry codes and changes in concentration in those markets. I think that makes a good headline, but it doesn't necessarily tell the story of how competition actually works in markets. It ignores the fact that the competition across broad industry sectors encompass, can be both over-inclusive and under-inclusive in terms of both demand side and supply side substitution. It ignores that there may be pro-competitive benefits that can result from competition, and it kind of gets us back into this one size fits all or one analysis fits all kind of mentality, where you start thinking of markets and the analysis just in terms of the number of competitors that are present in a market without necessarily thinking about how competition actually works on a day-to-day basis. So I take issue, kind of fundamentally with the concept that, measuring concentration and seeing increases in concentration against broad industry codes, is in itself a problem that we need to fix. The other things that we see are, concerns about data and monopoly leveraging or kind of gaining monopoly positions in markets through acquisitions of innovative companies or smaller nascent competitors. There's other tools that the antitrust laws have to address those. I'm not sure that addressing those through the context of a merger review process is really the right way to go about it. So I'm not sure I've answered your question other than just kind of pointed out some of the things that I think about. I'm just not sure that the problem, as people state, is as big as it seems. For sure, the agencies don't get everything 100% correct all the time. I think there are cases around the margins where there have been both under enforcement and over enforcement. But I think generally, just because I used this analogy earlier, you're kicking a soccer ball at a goal and sometimes you miss, doesn't mean you have to completely rewrite the rules of the game.
Randy, would you agree with Amanda's assessment that people are sort of making it out to be a bigger problem, that really the case law as it stands is pretty good?
Well, it depends on what case law we're talking about. So I think you mentioned that there's a theme out there that perhaps legislation is necessary to rectify some of the missteps that the courts have made. And so far what I've seen in terms of legislation is at least there's at least one bill out there that talks about maybe shifting the burden in litigation and merger practice, and then also setting up presumptions based upon different levels of industry concentration. Some of that stuff exists in the guidelines, or at least in older versions of the guidelines, and then that's shifted a little bit. And that's worth thinking about, but one of the things that I would worry about in that circumstance is we've had, we moved in litigation at least merger litigation, from a focus on presumptions towards looking more at the competitive effects analysis, which I think was productive, because ultimately we're trying to protect a competitive process. If we shifted back towards presumptions, do we end up taking all of the work that we were used to do in the competitive effects analysis and then jam that into the debate around whether the two companies are in the same product market? The fact of the matter is, when we're looking at a lot of transactions these days, we're dealing with differentiated product markets. And so it's not quite clear that product A is competing with product B, because they're not exactly the same thing. They're differentiated. So I'm not sure that ends up solving the problem. I think that there's actually law out there, and since no one else has brought it up yet, I'll mention that it's the Microsoft case that talks a little bit about protecting the competitive process. Tim Wu has made this point a few times in various presentations, and I believe Doug Melamed did as well, that the DC Circuit there was concerned with the possibility that squashing nascent competitors, and there wasn't a lot of talk about price. There wasn't a focus on that, perhaps what it requires is for the agencies to really emphasize that in some of their briefs, that they're going after protecting the competitive process, and if they lose at the district court level, perhaps those are things that they need to focus on in appellate litigation.
Thank you. And Amy, do you agree with that? It sounds like we should be using Microsoft as our model?
Perhaps, or at least maybe holding other companies up to the standards that the DC Circuit enumerated there. I keep going back to and agree with the focus on competitive effects. I think the challenges, and maybe part of the critique of existing case law, is that once you get in front of a generalist judge and you're marshaling in evidence not only of future effects, but also complicated economic analysis, it's difficult for the judge to wrap her or his head around that sometimes. We saw during AT&T Time Warner, Judge Leon grasping for a crystal ball and asking where he was supposed to find one, because he was being asked to do what all of us do, but that is speculate on what's going to happen in the future based on the competitive activity in front of you. Going back to Congress and its role, again, I think we as practitioners and people who advise companies directly, maybe we aren't the right people to answer the normative question of what should be the goal of antitrust policy and enforcement. That's where I think in true policy making, Congress probably would play more of a role if it wants to alter what we're operating with currently.
And
Can
Gabrielle,
I just, jump in on that? Because I think Listening to Randy and Amanda and Amy, I mean, to me, kind of gets to, is there a problem with the consumer welfare standard? And I think that, it depends how you interpret it. And there are some that I think have created this, these binary extremes of we need to overturn the consumer welfare standard and bring in a public interest standard or, some other standard. And then there are those that say consumer welfare is extremely narrow and it should just be focused on, essentially price effects. But I think most of us, including people here on the panel, I think there's recognition that the consumer welfare standard incorporates competitive process elements and innovation and quality, and that those things are all things that the consumer welfare standard is focused on and concerned about because it affects competition and consumers. And that's where kind of the dynamicism that Marnell and I were talking about before comes from, because there is that leeway. So then the question is, how do you leverage that consumer welfare standard to address current concerns, particularly when we're talking about the digital space and newer technologies and different kinds of market dynamics that don't fit into the neat box. And I think we saw it with the Apple case in front of the Supreme Court 2 weeks ago, that the justices were really struggling with the fact that it's not just a clear vertical relationship, that you have a different kind that hasn't been, really explored in the case law in the same way. So how do you apply Illinois BRIC in that context? And so I think that, figuring out ways to create tools that address the newer dynamics that we're dealing with is part of how we keep the consumer welfare standard fresh and dynamic. And so it is, it is hard to bring those cases, and there isn't necessarily case law that addresses it, and it's really hard to explain that to judges that are already grappling with old case law. But I think that that's where this opportunity, especially for the FTC, as it's having these hearings, as we're having this debate, comes in, that like recognizing that things like market power is a proxy, and there are different ways that you can have proxies, and it doesn't have to just be econometric analysis that has been done in a certain way, that there are other things that can provide potentially equally important proxies for whether or not there's a competitive problem. And I think what Holly mentioned in the prior panel about increasing technological expertise so that people can actually understand the facts and understand whether or not there is a competition problem. You have to understand how the technology works and who is competing and how is that competition taking place. One thing that we do at Verizon, we look at consumer survey data, and a lot of times enforcers will ask us for that, but it's not getting to the question that the enforcer actually wants. So it's not a particularly good proxy for what they are looking at, when they're looking at someone else's merger, for example, when they're looking at whatever it is that they're looking at. Perhaps the enforcers should have a unit that does that kind of qualitative evidence collection that provides that same kind of thing, so that you're not so reliant on what may not be the perfect proxy in this kind of situation, as we're dealing with different kinds of marketplace dynamics, economic situations. So I think that rather than focusing on overturning the consumer welfare standard, it should be, what are the tools that can really help us leverage the dynamic, vibrant standard that we have?
So one of the other things that Holly Vadova had mentioned on the previous panel was using the FTC's Section 6B authority to do these studies to inform sort of more targeted enforcement. And maybe just starting with you, Nella, is that one of the things that you would be comfortable with in terms of using the tools that currently exist and slightly pivoting towards the issues that we have in the tech industry today?
So sure, we definitely commend the FTC for all the work they're doing, and we encourage them to keep researching and learning from, and it also helps us all learn a little bit more about the tech industry and how it operates. something that strikes me a lot is that we worry a lot about concentration, but then when you go into the details of the tech industry and how competition takes place there, Michael Mandel just put out a paper, Michael Mandel from PPI, on how the companies compete against each other on a variety of products and services, and that is not so well known for the public. I think something that might be also informative is to compare the U.S. competition system under the consumer welfare standard to other competition systems existing out there, and you might learn that having an administrable standard that protects you from political interference, as I said before, it's really good for your economy. And there are 129 competition systems out there, and you can see different standards being applied, and you can see different results out there. So I really encourage you all to look at that. Another thing that might be interesting for the FTC to do is, for example, there's a lot of debate about whether the acquisition of startups are good or bad. It's a very challenging question. I think that deserves a lot of attention, and it's not an easy question, but I think the answer needs to be tailored to your own economy. The existence of Silicon Valley here, it's also an incentive for companies to innovate and for innovators to create more startups. That incentive doesn't exist in the EU, and it's definitely a different incentive. It can be called an incentive in China, maybe an imposition from the Chinese government. So I think there's a lot of studies to be made, and when deciding whether there's a problem or not, I think we're still lagging behind in doing economic analysis and more technical analysis in understanding the tech industry and in understanding how, I'm not American. You did something well. You have Silicon Valley, you're innovating, you're changing the world. We didn't do it in Europe, so I'm sure that you did something well. Let's understand what you did well, what can be improved, and then go ahead and move forward. But just don't jump into conclusions and blame Google, Facebook, Amazon, and all these big tech companies for the digital transformation that all of our societies are undergoing. That's a more philosophical question, but I think we should be very careful in not doing so.
Amanda?
Yeah, and we've spent quite a bit of time over the past few minutes talking about what the agencies can do in terms of studies and developing their learning, and I second all of that. I think, anytime that the agencies can educate themselves and learn about the industries that they're investigating, that's always a good thing. But let's also not forget that the parties and the counsel to the parties have their part to play as well. And I think it's important as you're counseling clients that are high tech or that really are coming to the agency in an industry where agency staff may not be as educated or may not have as much of a background, that it's a bit incumbent upon the parties to help the agency staff along. By the nature of the HSR process, the investigating staff have a very short period of time in which to get up to speed on your deal. And during that period of time, you want to help them learn about your industry as much as you can. There are, going back to your point, Gabriela, about, there's different data that they ask you for that might not be the thing for them to ask you for in this specific case. And you can help the agency staff along by pointing them in the right direction early on in the process. So, it's not just on the staff to kind of figure out what's the best way to move forward in your deal, but should be a partnership between the staff and the parties' counsel to get them where they need to be and to help them make the right decisions.
Thank you. Go ahead, Randy.
So we talked a little bit, and I shared some thoughts on legislation as to whether that could address some of the issues. And as I was trying to suggest, I think some of that is worth thinking about. I would just worry that is wouldn't solve the issue as much as probably something that's just right more in front, and perhaps it's so obvious that nobody talks about it, is more resources for the agencies. The agencies are woefully under budget, or not under budget, but underfunded rather, and they do a tremendous job of doing what they can with the meager resources they're provided. Unfortunately, the way they do that is by really grinding on the staff and some of the hardest working people I've ever dealt with. I think that if you want to reinvigorate the antitrust agencies and antitrust enforcement, you start with adequately funding the agencies. So that's probably the lowest hanging fruit.
Thank you. I have more questions, and I'm sure you all have more to say. I just want to make sure that we open it up to the audience since we only have a few minutes left. So first, does anybody in the audience have questions? Well, if you do, please raise your hand. But in the
If
meantime,
I could just add one thing,
Yeah.
just kind of footnote on your point, Randy, about funding the agencies. You know, I noticed just within the past, I think it's within the past month or 6 weeks, both FCC and SEC have opened offices of economic analysis at their agencies. So, you know, slightly different point, but, you know, I think there's, you know, increased focus around the government on this, and we're seeing it in other agencies too. But I second your view that the agencies could definitely use some more resources.
It was a theme in congressional testimony this week too, by both the FTC's chairman and AAG Del Rahim.
And to me, I mean, that, I think we're all agreed, give the FTC and DOJ more money. But I think that that just makes more sense to me when we're talking about dealing with these very complicated, complex issues of competition rather than going to legislation, which, you know, in terms of blunt tools, that seems much more blunt. That's going to have to play catch up and have to understand, you know, how things are evolving. Whereas these agencies have the expertise. They've seen different things. I think there is a lot of learning that can be applied, but there are trade-offs and you have to make certain decisions. And then there is the, you know, is it worth a potential loss when we can have a clear winner on healthcare or, you know, on something related to labor or something, and, you know, therefore we don't focus on harder cases. So I think.
So just to shift gears slightly, there was one more question I wanted to ask, and particularly since both Amy and Ella, I think you both touched on the global antitrust enforcement aspect, and I think from slightly different perspectives. You know, Amy, you had mentioned that there's been some discussion lately about how the U.S. has become sort of somewhat of an outlier, and I think talking about, you'd mentioned to me earlier about Walter Speller's piece, the Omega Man. And then Nella, you're talking about in some ways where the U.S. is actually doing a better job in terms of promoting innovation in technology than other jurisdictions. And so I was wondering if any of you had thoughts on sort of this, what seems to be perhaps a divergence in approaches to antitrust policy and enforcement when it comes to tech. So whoever feels most strongly, feel free to chime in.
I mean, I'll just to pick up on Walter Speller's article, which is titled "The Omega Man" and critiques Will Smith and I Am Legend. I recommend this to everybody. I don't think we want to abdicate our role in looking at these hard issues into our home industries. That's what I fear with competition enforcers in other jurisdictions getting out ahead of us.
So I think what they call the Brussels effect is undeniable. There are various reasons why people have started to copy more often the EU law than the US laws. To start with, it's easy to copy. You just have the guidelines, you have recommendations, you have directives, you just copy them. I've done a number of technical assistance, and it's much easier to carry a bunch of EU legal documents and explain to them how to walk through them than to get a bunch of case law from the US. Probably many jurisdictions come from civil nature jurisdictions which are not used to reading case law and extracting the jurisprudence from there. So there are many, many reasons why. But a fundamental thing that I think it's important to highlight is where the US economy comes from and where the EU economy comes from. In the EU, they were all former monopolies. All the digital companies that are trying to compete with some of the members that I represent, like Telefonica, Deutsche Telekom, Orange, they are all former monopolies. And it's a different culture. They were used to being able of leveraging on the government to, instead of compete, advance their competitive position through other means. And it takes time to get rid of that culture. Whereas in the US, you create from scratch. You created all these from scratch. So there are fundamental differences in between the two systems, the two jurisdictions, the two economies, and the two kind of thought process. If you ask a young engineer here in the US whether they dream of becoming the CEO of Microsoft, for example, they might say yes. Whereas most of Europeans, they might say, you're crazy, I just want to be a civil servant and have like my there are a lot of cultural differences that also influence how antitrust enforcement is shaped. And the problem or the challenge here is that the digital economy has no borders. And at the end of the day, whoever is stronger is going to regulate the world. And fortunately, unfortunately, I studied in both places. I wasn't raised in the consumer welfare standard world. I turned to the consumer welfare standard world for the past 10 years. Fortunately, unfortunately, whoever is more restricted is going to kind of influence more in a way, because at the end, a digital company that operates throughout the world has to comply with all the laws. Privacy law is a good example of this. I think that is why it's very important. I know DOJ has been doing a lot of work in enhancing its international shop. FTC has a very solid history of working with other agencies. And I think one of the roles that the FTC and DOJ should continue to do is to continue to promote studies and make sure that agencies around the world have access to many of the studies that are taking, that universities here and experts here endorse, because there's more money, and there's more time as well to conduct those studies to make sure that they understand the markets before regulating or going against them.
Those are some really interesting points, Nella. I just want, because we're out of time, I just want to basically bring things full circle to the discussion that we had at the very beginning and ask, because I know at least one of you has some thoughts on how you would rename this panel.
I don't even remember. That question was directed at me, but I don't even remember what I said.
Or I guess maybe just more broadly, what better reflects your views than the status quo proponents?
Yeah. I mean, I think that status quo sounds really stodgy, and like there's no dynamicism to it. And I think that it's more of an appreciation of the consumer welfare standard as something that is dynamic, is flexible, and it's really how do we make sure that the tools that we're using reflect that and are ones that can attack the different types of problems that we're facing.
I think that's actually probably a perfect note to end on. So thank you to all of our panelists.